Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I'm your host, Ozzie Ostwalt. Here in the high country of Boone, North Carolina, we understand the awe and the sense of the sacred that mountains can bring to our consciousness. Religions around the globe have always looked to the peaks for guidance, laws, and even God. My guest today, Dr. Edwin Bernbaum, has climbed many of these peaks that are special to religions around the world and writes about the relationship between religion and nature. Perhaps he can help us today to understand just what it is about those beautiful landscapes that inspire us so. Welcome, Dr. Bernbaum.
Thank you.
May I call you Ed?
Sure.
All right, great. Thank you for being with us. You're on our campus for a day or two.
Yep.
And we'll be giving a lecture. I know you met with our students this afternoon.
It was really exciting. It was really good conversation.
That's great. Well,
students.
We appreciate you coming to our campus, and I wanted to show this beautiful book, second edition of Sacred Mountains of the World. And we have a gorgeous picture of Mount Everest, maybe one of the most well-known peaks in the world.
Yes, well, it's probably the most well-known peak today. It's sacred, but not as sacred as Westerners think. We can talk about that a little. And in the bottom is a monastery, which is at 16,500 feet above sea level, which makes it 2,000 feet higher than the highest mountain in the lower 48 states.
Oh, that's amazing. You've got all these numbers in your head, right?
Well, I took the pictures, so I've
yeah,
been there.
Okay.
It's there.
And you've climbed some of these mountains, too.
A few, not Everest,
Yeah.
but I've been to the foot of it on both sides.
Well, it's a fascinating book, almost as fascinating as your life. And
More fascinating.
I'm going to read the first sentence because I want to give a kind of feel for how beautiful some of the prose is here, so with your permission.
Sure.
As the highest and most dramatic features of the natural landscape, mountains have an extraordinary power to evoke the sacred. The ethereal rise of a ridge in mist, the glint of moonlight on an icy face, a flare of gold on a distant peak. Such glimpses of transcendent beauty can reveal our world as a place of unimaginable mystery and splendor, and can overwhelm us with feelings of wonder and fear. That's beautifully said, and I think it really captures the heart of this intersection of religion and religious feelings and the way mountains tend to elicit those in our lives.
Right.
Yeah. So you actually grew up inside of the Andes Mountains?
Yes. Well, my parents were in the Foreign Service, so when I was 2 years old, we moved to Quito, Ecuador, which is up in the middle of the Andes. So my earliest memories are of snow-capped peaks on the equator. And, I was drawn to the mystery of snow. We moved back to the Washington, D.C., and there was something when it snowed, which it rarely did in Washington. It sort of transformed everything into this magical mystery, beautiful place, the smoothness of the snow. So when we moved back to Ecuador when I was a teenager, I thought it'd be great to go up to snow on the equator, the conjunction of opposites, the
Right.
tropics.
Yeah.
And I was put in touch with an Ecuadorian mountaineering club called New Horizons, Nuevos Horizontes in Spanish, and I started climbing with them and in college. And that led eventually to my going to Nepal with the Peace Corps after I graduated from college. And when I left the Peace Corps, we tried to climb a mountain called Annapurna South. Annapurna is a sacred mountain in the Himalayas. The highest peak was the first of the world's highest peaks to be climbed in 1950. And just as an amusing aside, when I was a teenager, about 15 or so, my younger sister checked a book out of the library called Annapurna, and she thought it was a Nancy Drew type mystery story about a girl named Annapurna. And she was partly right, because Annapurna is the name of a goddess. But she wasn't interested in the book, and I was fascinated by it. And it inspired an interest not only in climbing, but also the sacredness of mountains, because it's one of the only books where the author had a mystical, spiritual experience as he approached the summit of the mountain, and he describes it beautifully.
Yeah.
So,
well, speaking of, I want to come back to Nepal, but speaking of mystical experiences, there's a passage in your book toward the end where you're reflecting on an experience you had shortly after almost losing your life in an avalanche. And when I read that, you were describing how beautiful it was and how it made you feel. That's what came to my mind, that this is a kind of a sense of awe that borders on the mystical and the transcendent. Is that what you were feeling at the time?
Yeah, in that particular, I was up near, I went out to Mount Everest, and this was when China, occupied Tibet, which it still does, but back then Tibet was completely closed to the outside world and very much unknown. And I was lying in a sleeping bag at night at about 17,000 feet, and I realized I was on the edge of Tibet, which had unmapped, and there was something about the unknown that really attracted me. And one of the aspects of the sacred later on, and I discuss this in my book, is the sacred is the unknown and ultimately the unknowable.
Right.
It knows you, you don't know it.
Yeah.
And I remember, having this sudden sense that the whole world was just like that, as unmapped and unknowable as Tibet. And it immediately, it gave me this wonderful feeling. It took me back to my earliest memories when I was very small, and we'd go out and watch airplanes taking off over the mountains in Ecuador when I was small. And when I was, when you're at that age, the world is unmapped. You don't know what's there, and it's sort of endlessly fascinating. And it sort of reawakened that sense of wonder and freshness that a child has. And in a way, I think the spiritual quest of religions is, as you go older, you gather wisdom, but you've also got to get to the point where you return to the sort of simplicity and innocence of a child, combining it with the wisdom of age.
Yeah. That's beautifully said. So this kind of sense of mystery and the unknown, the ineffable, this is a lot of what religious studies scholars talk about, and this is what you describe as feelings that mountains across cultures and across time tend to elicit in people. So it really, I guess, what you're suggesting is that there's something about mountains that is religious in their very nature, because of the way we interact with them.
Yeah, well, I mean, of all, as you indicated from the sentence you wrote, the opening of my book, mountains are, very dramatic features of the landscape, and also they direct your eyes up toward the heavens, which are associated with heaven.
Right.
So there's, the associations of divinity. But what I found, and one of the points I make in the book is that people will say, well, mountains are sacred because they're high places. Yes, many mountains are sacred because they're high places. They're close to heaven and so on. But there are a number of other ways in which they're sacred. And there are an incredibly diverse number of ways in different traditions, and even within the same traditions, in which mountains evoke a sense of the sacred. And it's that diversity that I think gives them their power as religious symbols. So, the mountain may be revered because it's a high place. Everest is by the Tibetans. And also, in particular in the West, it's a semi-sacred place in a secular sense, your area of expertise, because in the West we put ultimate value on whatever is number one, and one aspect of the sacred is whatever has ultimate value. So Everest is the highest mountain, gives it a mystic aura, and it becomes a symbol of the highest goals you can strive to attain in the Western world. What's interesting is, for the Tibetans, it's a sacred mountain, but a relatively minor one compared to other mountains.
Yeah, I remember reading this in your book. You said the Sherpas have another peak in mind when they think about the most sacred. So they have no problem taking tours up Everest, but they would never...
well, actually, there's even a smaller peak right in their home country. It's 10,000 feet lower, but it's much more sacred for them, and they would never climb that. Everest they'll climb, yes. But Westerners tend to project, our ideas onto the Tibetans and Sherpas and say, well, it's often translated, the Tibetan name, Chomolungma, as Goddess Mother of the World or the universe. But that's a Western projection, or an outside projection, not just Westerners. First of all, in Buddhism, there is no Goddess Mother of the World or the universe. It doesn't work in their religion. And secondly, it's a contraction of the name of the goddess. And she's a goddess who grants worldly benefits like long life, food, wealth. But the higher attainments, the spiritual attainments, have to do with another mountain, which is much more important, and which is the most sacred mountain in the world for about 1 billion people in Asia and immigrants who've moved west, and followers of 4 major religions, a little bit like Jerusalem, which is sacred, of course, to followers of 3 religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam.
Yeah. This is Kailash?
This is Mount Kailash.
And we have a picture of it here. So tell me about Kailash. I remember reading about this in the book, and it's one of the ones that kind of stood out to me.
Well, Kailash is in western Tibet, So it's just beyond the main range of the Himalayas in the Tibetan Plateau. It's 7,000 feet lower than Everest. It's only 22,000 feet high. Everest is 29. But it stands out by itself, almost like a volcano. So it attracts attention, and it's a dome, so it looks like a Buddhist monument called a stupa or a Hindu temple. And so there are many temples in India called Kailasanatha, which means the Lord of Kailas. And that is, for the Hindus, it's the abode of one of the three forms of the supreme deity, a deity called Shiva, who's associated with meditation, and he's supposed to be meditating up on top of the mountain. Tibetan Buddhists regard it as the abode of a different deity that they invoke in meditation. But for Hindus and Buddhists, and also followers of some other religions, it stands at the center of the universe. So it's supposed to be the physical manifestation of a mythical mountain that's a cosmic axis that links heaven to hell and our world all in between. And this mountain dwarfs Everest. It's over 80,000 miles high. It's called Mount Meru or Sumeru. So when you go out to the mountain, you don't climb it. You walk around it the way you would a religious monument. And it's the source of four major rivers, including tributaries of the Ganges River, which is the most sacred river in the world for Hindus in India.
Yeah, so you mentioned something that really caught my attention. One of the ways that mountains appear sacred to us is as, well, we talk about height a lot, but this idea of being the center of the universe, the center axis, the connection between the heavens and the earth, and I guess the underworld.
Underworld as well, right.
So is this found across traditions in many different religions?
Yes, it is. There's some scholars that want to say that every sacred mountain is a cosmic axis. And I found in doing research for the book, because I've looked at mountains all around the world, the title of the book is Sacred Mountains of the World. There's only one continent I didn't deal with, and that was Antarctica, because I don't know if mountains are sacred to penguins or not. But anyway, they're important in a number of traditions, but there are other reasons why mountains are sacred where they're not cosmic centers and axes. So mountains are, in particular in a lot of traditions, they're the deities themselves, or the abode of a deity, like Mount Fuji in Japan, or mountains are places of power. The power can be, raw physical power, which is a manifestation of a deity, like Kilauea and Hawaii volcanoes with the lava pouring out, or there's the major sacred mountain in China, in Taishan, is connected with the political power of the ancient emperors, politics and so on. Mountains are revered in many cultures around the world for a very practical reason, which is also spiritual, which is they're sources of water, and water is life.
Right.
Very, very important.
Yeah.
And then I think in the West, and where we really relate a lot to mountains, is they're places of revelation, transformation, inspiration, and renewal. And I worked on projects with national parks, including Great Smoky Mountains National Parks. And in a way, national parks in the United States are sort of secular shrines that people go to for kind of a spiritual, physical renewal, like a sacred mountain.
Yeah. Since you mentioned in the West that mountains are often associated with revelation, let's talk about another mountain that our listeners will recognize, Mount Sinai.
Yes, exactly.
And I think we have a picture here of a monastery that is built at the foot of Mount Sinai, and of course, you might want to comment on the monastery, but Sinai in tradition, in Judaism and Christianity, is the place where the law was given. The Torah.
Well, exactly. I mean, in traditional Jewish, well, first of all, some people think, well, mountains, that's something, sacred mountains are something from other traditions, very deeply embedded in Western religion, Christianity, Judaism, and also Islam. And the three most important events in the Torah, the Old Testament, are the three covenants that are made with Noah on Mount Ararat, then with Abraham and a binding of Isaac on Mount Moriah, and then the single most important event in traditional Jewish history is the revelation and covenant on Mount Sinai, with Moses going up the mountain and bringing down the Ten Commandments. And you can see how important that is in Western tradition, because the Ten Commandments are the basis of much of law and ethics in Western cultures and societies even today. So sometimes I'll ask people, who do you think is the most famous and influential mountain climber in Western history? And people will say, Sir Edmund Hillary, who made the first ascent of Everest. And I'll say, no, it's Moses.
That's good. Yeah, that's great.
But he was quite a mountain climber. The story, whether he climbed the mountain or not, the story is incredibly impressive.
Yeah. You
and,
mentioned, yeah.
and the monastery at the foot. In the Bible, it's very unclear as to where Mount Sinai is in Exodus. So there have been a number of candidates. And the picture I think that you have up on the screen is of a mountain called Jebel Musa, which is the mountain of Moses. And for Christians, that's generally the site of Mount Sinai. And at the foot of it is one of the oldest Christian monasteries in the world, the monastery of St. Catherine. The Desert Fathers went and started meditating there around the 2nd century, drawn to where they thought Moses had experienced God. And then an emperor of Byzantium built that monastery as a fortified monastery to protect them from marauding Bedouins and others. So it's a fortified monastery with a wall around it. And it's supposed to be on the traditional site of the burning bush, which is at the foot of Mount Sinai.
Right.
There's an amusing, I'll just add this, in the late 1980s, the Egyptian government announced plans to build a cable car up to the summit of Mount Sinai and put a casino in the top. And this aroused consternation and ire throughout the world. And Time magazine had an end piece where they took the Egyptian government to task for doing this.
Right.
And the project, fortunately, was abandoned.
Well, thank goodness for that, yeah. So the monastery here, is it a pilgrimage site or is it?
I think it is for Christians. And what a lot of people do is they will climb the mountain in the dark at night and then watch the sunrise from the summit. And it's really impressive because it's this primordial landscape. It's just the kind of landscape you would think where Moses came and, was revelation from God. And there is a Christian chapel and also a Muslim shrine on the summit. And it's also sacred for Muslims.
I think I know the answer to this question, but oftentimes mountains are sites for pilgrims.
Yes,
right?
of course.
And there will be holy places built there, or the mountain itself might be considered holy. What are some of the most important pilgrimage sites that are located in some of these important mountains across the world?
Oh, well, Kailash, for example, is a pilgrimage site, and it used to be one of the longest and most arduous pilgrimages in the world. If you came from India, you had to walk for 3 weeks up over high passes over the Himalayas to get to the mountain. If you're coming from Tibet, it might take you 11 months. And then the ritual was to walk around the mountain to circumambulate it and go over a pass at 18,500 feet. And there are pilgrims who get even more benefit from their pilgrimage to Kailash by doing full-length body prostrations all the way around the mountain over snowfields.
Oh my goodness.
It takes them about 3 weeks. When I did it, it took about 2.5 days. And Tibetans, grandparents and grandchildren who are in much better shape than I was, do it in 1 day. It's about a 30-mile loop over an 18,000-foot pass.
Oh my goodness.
But other pilgrimage places, for example, there's a major pilgrimage place in Spain just outside of Barcelona, Montserrat, which is a very spectacular sacred mountain in Spain. From a distance, it's got rock towers, so it looks like a castle. And actually, Wagner, when he wrote the opera Parsifal, Montserrat was his inspiration for the Grail Castle.
Oh, really?
And there are lots of Spanish pilgrims who go there because on the slopes, tucked in among the rock towers, is a church with a Black Madonna, and a very, very famous and revered icon. It's a religious icon in the Catholic world.
Oh. Well, since we're mentioning kind of individual sites, a place of particular interest to me, and I haven't been there, it's a place I would love to go, is Machu Picchu. And we have a picture here that you took, I believe, of Machu Picchu. What is it about that place? It just seems so shrouded in mystery.
Well, there was the mist there, which makes it mysterious.
That was a great photograph, yeah.
Yes, I took that early in the morning. Yeah. Well, Machu Picchu, it was lost in the jungle and supposedly rediscovered by an American explorer. And there have been a number of speculations and theories about why it was chosen and why it's there. And to me, the most interesting one is by a colleague of mine, Johann Reinhardt, who does. He works in a field called high altitude archaeology. So he does research. He's discovered mummies at 22,000 feet, highest religious and architectural sites in the world. And his hypothesis about Machu Picchu is that it was situated there for ceremonial purposes because it's in between 4 sacred mountains at the bend of a sacred river. There were other hypotheses as well, but it's very hard to tell.
Yeah. It's become quite a tourist attraction.
Yeah,
as many of these places have.
Right, and people will come for the day from from Cusco, and there's a train that takes you down below, and then buses take you up. The reason I got that beautiful picture was when I went there, it was before the hotel next to the site got very expensive, so I stayed there with my sister, and the crowds came from 10 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and then we had it to ourselves in the early morning. As you saw there, there's nobody in the picture, and late
wonderful.
in the afternoon.
Yeah.
But it is a very evocative place.
Well, let's get a little closer to home.
Okay.
All right. We've got this wonderful picture that you took of the Great Smokies.
Right.
And I know you spent some time in the Great Smoky Mountains. Tell us a little bit.
Well, that
about
actually came out of the book.
Yeah.
Because I eventually wrote. I got in. I spent a lot of time in the Himalayas, and I eventually wound up trekking back to Kathmandu with the head lama, the main monastery, Tibetan Buddhist monastery in the south of Everest, and we started a project to microfilm rare Tibetan books at his monastery, and in the course of that, I got interested in what mountains mean to people, and so eventually I wrote this book on sacred mountains of the world. Mm-hmm. But as a result of the book, I was invited to give a talk at a conference in New Zealand, and I did it on the policy implications of sacred mountains for environmental conservation. And that led to a project that I started and then implemented for an organization called the Mountain Institute, which was based up in the Appalachian Mountains in West Virginia. So there's a connection there. Sure. And we worked with national parks, including Great Smoky Mountains National Park, to develop interpretive materials that use the evocative, cultural, spiritual, aesthetic meanings and associations of different features in these parks, like the rivers, mountains, wildlife, eagles, and so on, as a way of connecting with, what do these places mean for mainstream Americans, Native Hawaiians, and cultures around the world. The National Park Service got really interested in this because it was a way of getting people from many different traditions interested in supporting the Park Service. And one of the parks we worked at was Great Smoky Mountains. And so what we did there was there's a river that runs from a visitor center down to the town of Cherokee on the North Carolina side, the Okanalufti Visitor Center. So we did a project that brought together the Cherokees and the park to develop a series of wayside signs along the river. It's a very easy walk, linking features of the natural landscape you see to Cherokee's stories and spiritual traditions. And the signs are on one side in English in the words of a Cherokee elder or storyteller, and on the right it's in the Cherokee syllabary, translated, and in the middle it's illustrated by a painting by a contemporary Cherokee artist. So one of the signs is up on top of Clingman's Dome, which is the highest mountain in Great Smoky Mountains, and I took that picture from the summit. And there the idea is Clingman's Dome is sacred because it's a place of healing. There's supposed to be a magic lake, according to Cherokee tradition, where if animals go into it, they come out the other side healed, if they have a broken wing, for example, or leg. And it was also very important as a place of refuge. When the Cherokees were removed in the Trail of Tears, there were a few of them who were able to hide out in Clingman's Dome, and they came back down and reestablished the Eastern Band of the Cherokees today, based in the town of Cherokee.
So since you're making these connections between indigenous people, their mythologies and their tales and their beliefs, I've got another picture here that even gets us a little closer to home.
Okay.
Folks around here will recognize this photograph as the profile on Grandfather Mountain.
Right.
And you can hike the profile trail and see this person. So legend has it, as I understand it, that, and I know you haven't worked with this mountain in particular, but...
So I'm anxious to hear what you have to say about this.
So
I always collect new material.
Well, this is a good one for you, I think. Legend has it that the Cherokee in this area identified this as the grandfather spirit. So it's a bit of ancestor veneration tied in with this mountain in particular, which gives us this idea of animism in indigenous traditions, where what we would normally consider as contemporary Westerners to be inanimate objects can actually have spirit and can contain spirit. So if the legends that I've heard are true, then Grandfather Mountain has this connection with the ancestor spirits of indigenous people.
Well, and also, the Appalachian Mountains are very important culturally, and there are all sorts of ways. Another way in which mountains are sacred is they become symbols of identity. And I think the Appalachian Mountains are, they become symbols of identity for people here. That's why people are attracted to a place like Boone. There's another way in which I think the Appalachian Mountains are important, spiritually speaking, whether or not it's indigenous or contemporary society. And this is a story experienced in the Appalachian Mountains. I was up in West Virginia, and I was talking to one of the board members of the Mountain Institute I was working for, and he said, well, we don't worship mountains here in the U.S. They don't have spirits there. So sacred mountains, American Indians do that, Tibetans, we don't do it. And I said, well, we have sacred places here in the U.S. We call them churches and synagogues.
Right.
You don't worship the church. You go to the church to worship. And in a similar way for people like Thoreau or John Muir in California and people out here as well, mountains were sort of natural churches where you could go and commune with God, with nature, something of deeper significance or reality for you.
Yeah. You mentioned Thoreau. Another story that you told in your book talks about William James.
Yeah.
You tell about him taking a camping trip, I believe, in Maine.
It was up in Adirondacks in New York
Adirondacks,
State. Yeah.
And then shortly after that wrote Varieties of Religious Experience, which is a classic for religious studies scholars.
Well, he talks about all sorts of religious experiences people have in that book.
Right.
And the closest he ever came to an experience like that was the night on Mount Marcy that you're referring to, where he was overwhelmed with a sense of nature spirits and he just couldn't understand what was going on. If he had been one of the Indians from the area like Mohawk or Iroquois or Seneca, they would have explained to him, yes, you were having a vision, like a vision quest, and it would have been acceptable to him. But in any case, I think that helped to inspire him because a few months after that, he gave the lectures which became the Varieties of Religious Experience.
Yeah, the mountains as a source of inspiration was something that caught my attention.
It's a very, very important. And if you look at the origins of the modern day environmental movement, it comes out of that. If you look at particularly at the writings of John Muir, who was very influential in national parks like Yosemite, and also Thoreau and Emerson, they wanted to preserve mountains, in particular in wilderness areas and nature, as places people can go to for spiritual renewal and inspiration, and that's a major role of sacred mountains.
Well, we're about out of time. There's so much I want to ask you, mountains and climate change, and for one, that we'll have to get to it another time. But I do want to ask you one quick question, and it's sort of like asking you which is your favorite child, I guess. But do you have a favorite mountain or a favorite mountain experience?
Well, there's one mountain where I had the most powerful experience I've ever had in the mountains, and this is Annapurna South, where I was caught in an avalanche. And I was trying to climb it, and basically a glacier broke off above us. As far as I knew, you couldn't survive an avalanche like that because it had ice as well as snow. They're the largest avalanches in the world. And it swept me about 1,000 feet down. And the way I survived it was basically by giving up, and something deep within me just sort of rose up and took over, and I just sort of popped out at the end. It wasn't anything under my conscious direction. So it sort of awakened me to the power and mystery of mountains, and also the power and mystery that mountains can awaken within each one of us. And that was basically kind of a turning point in my life, and sort of eventually led to my interest in sacred mountains. And it turned out it was on a mountain named for a Hindu goddess, actually in a valley which was supposed to be a sacred sanctuary.
That's one of many powerful stories that you tell in Sacred Mountains of the World, and I appreciate you joining us today to talk about this fascinating work.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed the discussion with you.
Thank you. And thank you for joining us today. Until next week, when we continue to explore the relationship between religion and culture here on App TV, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.